Nancy Pelosi knows this, but her donors know this as well, and they don't like it. Big pharma, big insurance, they're not on board with this. Force the vote has been extremely controversial inside of the liberal wing or the progressive wing, I would say, more of the progressive side. You've got people like myself who agree with Jimmy Dore. This was a strategy that Jimmy Dore put forward, saying that the progressive members of the House, when it's time to vote for Nancy Pelosi as Speaker after the new year, rather than just going along and voting for Mama Bear, instead stand strong, stand together and say, we're not going to vote for you unless you guarantee that there is a Medicare for all vote, that you put that bill on the floor and let everybody go on the record as to where they stand on that vote. The reason why Nancy doesn't want to put the Medicare for all bill on the floor is because she knows it's a death sentence for Democrats when they want to be reelected. She knows that Medicare for all is an extremely popular bill. It's extremely popular with the majority of Americans, that even some Republicans will vote for it. She knows this. She knows that Democrats will have no choice if they want to be reelected, but to vote yes on Medicare for all because it is so popular. So she's going to argue, as she has been arguing, that, well, no, it would be too divisive. There would be members of our Democratic Party, House members that would lose their seats because people would, they're in real moderate districts. She gives us all of this lip service. And at the end of the day, the bottom line is that even some Republicans are for Medicare for all, that it is an extremely popular proposition across America. Now, there are some nuanced differences. There are some people that say, well, we don't need to get rid of private insurance. Bernie Sanders even said that in the earlier days when he was promoting Medicare for all. He said, well, no, there's still a place for private insurance. It would just be everybody's covered under Medicare for all. And then if you want some extra fancy bells and whistles, then you can have that. That is what they do in England. Everybody has government health care. And then if you're rich and you're a person of means and you want something extra fancy, then you can buy supplemental insurance on top of your government insurance to get you all of the other fancy things that you want. Nancy Pelosi knows this, but her donors know this as well, and they don't like it. Big pharma, big insurance, they're not on board with this. And they don't want that vote to happen. And that is the real reason why we're not getting one of the most popular pieces of legislation on the floor for just a vote. So she's stalling. She doesn't want to do it. And there's a bunch of establishment mouthpieces who were once progressive who are now not. The progressive movement, I believe in 2020, we have seen some serious brain rot happening in the progressive movement. And it is the things that should have been fundamentally progressive all along suddenly are not. You've got progressives that were championing Joe Biden because, well, when he gets in there, he's going to put in some progressive people into his cabinet. Like as if that happened. Those of us who knew that wasn't going to happen, we knew that wasn't going to happen. And guess what? It didn't happen. That was fantasy land, thinking, well, once we get Joe Biden in there, then he'll at least give us this really progressive cabinet. No, he won't. He's establishment. It's not going to happen. And then, so in 2020, we're seeing this great divide of progressivism where you're seeing many of the progressives who championed Bernie Sanders, who championed Medicare for all, who were on that road for the last 4 years or even longer. Now in 2020, we saw the split. And it was all of these progressives who said, no, you must vote blue no matter who. The same progressives who after 2016 were mad that Bernie Sanders didn't start a third party. The same progressives who were mad that Bernie Sanders didn't fight back. So what would be the real downside? Now, if we're going to take this force the vote all the way to the end, where it is the worst possible outcome, Nancy Pelosi loses the speakership and it goes to Kevin McCarthy. Dun, dun, dun. So if those squad members were there, but they vote for, let's say, somebody else, let's say they cast collectively their vote for Bernie Sanders to be Speaker of the House, which, yes, you can do. You can actually vote for anybody to be Speaker. It doesn't have to be a sitting House member. It could be me. It could be you. It could be anybody. Okay. So they could cast their vote for anyone. If they decided to collectively do that, then the total number of votes cast, Kevin McCarthy would have to get a majority of the total number of votes cast. So if they voted, if all the Democrats vote, they have the majority. And if a certain subset of those Democrats vote for somebody else, Kevin McCarthy still would not have the majority of all votes. It would have to go back to another vote. And I believe there's been 12 or 14 times in history since the beginning of the country where the House members would vote. There was no majority for one person. They'd vote again. There was no majority. They'd vote again. And they would do that until they finally would compromise or negotiate and get themselves to a majority. So they would have to actually negotiate it out, which is really a good strategy to say to those progressive members, withhold your vote and force the negotiation. This isn't just get Kevin McCarthy elected. That's not what would happen. What would happen is you would force a negotiation. And Nancy Pelosi, neither Nancy nor Kevin McCarthy would be Speaker of the House at that point because neither of them would have received the full number of votes. So a better way to explain it is, you know that in order to become president of the United States, you need to reach 270 electoral college votes. It's kind of like that in the House. You have to reach, but it's not a majority of the number of actual House seats. It's the majority of votes cast. So you'd have to hit that mark, whatever that is, with whoever's voting. Look, what the squad could do is they could say, we're just not going to vote for you. We're going to get enough votes, 9 or 10, I think is what they need, in order to make it to where you don't get it and neither does Kevin. And now you're going to have to negotiate with us if you want us to vote for you. And in order to become speaker, you're going to need to negotiate. And they should just protest. You know, this is what progressives always say they're for, protesting. Well, then protest. Protest. Silent, peaceful protest. Say, we are not giving you our vote until you guarantee us a Medicare for all House floor vote. That's what we want. It's that simple. Now, let's just go worst case scenario. Let's just say, no, you know, the numbers are off and somehow Kevin McCarthy does just end up being Speaker of the House, that it would cost Nancy Pelosi the speakership and it would go to the Republican guy. Let's say that's worst case scenario. So what, guys? So what? So what? Nothing would change if Kevin McCarthy became Speaker of the House. Nothing would fundamentally change. For one, you have a Democrat sitting in the White House. So even if Kevin McCarthy and let's say Mitch McConnell does gain the majority of the Senate again, and these two come up with all this Republican legislation and they pass it through the House and they pass it through the Senate, which they wouldn't, because they still wouldn't have a majority of Republican votes in the House. So no Republican legislation would actually pass. If something did, worst case scenario, and it got up to Joe Biden's desk, he's not going to sign Republican legislation, depending on what that legislation is. If it's establishment legislation, then sure, but they would do that anyway, even with Nancy Pelosi being Speaker of the House. There is literally nothing to lose, even if Kevin McCarthy became Speaker. Now, there would be something to lose if, let's say, Trump were still president and Mitch McConnell had the Senate. Then that would be a scenario where it's like, okay, now maybe that's really dicey. I mean, if you allow the Republicans to control everything, then you're going to get a bunch of possibly Republican legislation through, but not really even in that scenario, because again, Democrats still have the majority of votes in the House. That doesn't change. So there's really nothing to lose. Kevin McCarthy being Speaker of the House, worst case scenario means 2 years of nothing changing. But guess what? Under Nancy Pelosi, there will be 2 years of nothing changing. There's going to be little tiny token virtue signaling legislation, nothing of meaning, nothing of value. So there really is nothing to lose by forcing the vote now. Now is the time to do it. You have a Democrat who's going to be taking over the White House. Now's the time to do it. And it's insane not to. And it's actually insane that any progressive would say, no, that it's a bad idea. We can't, because Kevin McCarthy, you know, he'll become Speaker and then all hell breaks loose when you know Democrats still hold the majority of the votes. That doesn't make any logical sense. It just goes to show that you've become an establishment shill.